opposition has to defend is a world where the international communities fail to mitigate the worst conflicts that have happened within status quo. That they cause the escalation, for example, of the Rohingya conflict and the humanitarian crises in Myanmar, the humanitarian crises in Syria. That was the war that they had to defend. A few pieces of said then, what is the R2P principle? We tell you that it was established by the UN post-World War II after Hitler killed millions of Jews, right? And even though, we tell you that the innocent lives like these are still killed to this day, even if it is to a lesser extent than at World War II, these lives are just as valuable. We tell you that there are three principles and three pillars to the responsibility to protect principle. Firstly, the state should protect individuals from genocide, from war crimes, from ethnic cleansing, and from crimes against humanity. Secondly, the international community should assist these states in being able to fulfill these obligations. And thirdly and lastly, if the state consistently and manifestly fails to do so, then the international community must prepare themselves to take action that is suitable and prepared in a timely manner. We tell you then what our 2 key principles would look like was to intervene within these countries, was to do things like send troops, like send things like peacekeeping missions, to do things like overthrow dictatorships and unstable regimes in the very first place. We tell you then that this is likely to be in very politically unstable regimes in the very first place. What is the problem then? The problem then is that the innocent lives are still killed like this to this very day, right? There's so many dictatorships and unstable regimes, and the people who are affected are the innocent mothers, or the innocent children, the innocent grandparents, and the innocent fathers that have not consented to the regime, to the oppressive regime, and have not asked for this oppression in the very first instance. What we have to defend then is not the excessive use of military intervention, just in retrospectively, the action of it has caused more lives lost than more lives that could have been saved at the end of the day. The alternative they had to defend was the alternative when, even though they had to defend, like even if all of the other alternatives were exhausted, even when economic sanctions were put on countries, and all that did was just make leaders leech more off of the poor, even though all of those alternatives were already exhausted, why we not ought to use this alternative, why ought we not use military intervention in the very first place. I'll prove to you 3 things then. Firstly, on why the R2P being invoked is a principal obligation of all states, but secondly, why we would prevent so many more atrocities, and thirdly, why the processes of intervention are much better on our side of the house. First argument then, on why we limit the atrocities that have occurred. Firstly, what has occurred, right? First argument then, on the principal justification of this in the very first place. We tell you that the instances where this has occurred has always been because of things like colonialism, right? It was colonialism that caused the insurgency. It was the colonialism that caused the instability within the regions today. It did things like jump initial tribes that were established in the very first place, made them rule over one another, and when these Western countries left, this led to things like civil war, this led to things like ethnic rivalry, and this led to things like forming new post-colonial multi-ethnic provinces that led to further instability and further insurgency within status quo. The Western and international community then is heavily responsible for these civil wars and instability that exists today, for the genocide and for the ethnic cleansing and the territorial disputes that have caused and lost millions of lives. Therefore then, they're responsible for having to be able to deploy forces and to deploy peacekeeping forces to keep these regimes in check. But secondly then, if you do not buy the point about colonialism, we'll tell you why humanitarian harms inherently ought to be stopped anyways. Human rights literally have no borders. What this means then is that it's literally why so many countries accept things like refugees to find solace into their country and to be able to absorb these people. Because the problem of genocide was massive, right? Because of tens and thousands of lives and civilians were killed just because they dissent the state, just because they didn't accept the state that was constantly oppressing them. The countries in political instability constantly wiped out the entire ethnic minorities that they didn't agree with just because they wanted to maintain government legitimacy. The people this affected them were the most vulnerable individuals, were the most innocent individuals, like children, like mothers, like the lives that have been lost, that are so valuable at the end of the day. They have to defend this then. They have to defend the people who have suffered. We defend then the people who have suffered from dictatorship and have been heavily oppressed in a regime that fails to protect them, but they have to defend where the world and the international community also fails to protect these individuals in the instance where the regime fails to protect them as well. Second argument then, on why we limit atrocities that have occurred. Before that, I'll take a point.
Who is in control of these international communities post-World War II II, where the most powerful countries were just the countries that won the war, aka Western countries, economically powerful countries and such.
No, there are very, very established countries that literally control these peacekeeping missions in the first place, right? If you listen to my setup, you hear that I told you that the UN literally established this in the very first place, that it took many countries, like with powerful militaries, like France, like the US, like all of these to collectively take action and to protect all of these countries that were in vulnerable positions in the very first place. Why do we eliminate atrocities that have occurred then? What has occurred, right? We tell you that this is atrocities like in the Rwanda genocide, where hundreds and thousands of innocent civilians were killed, and the Libya dictatorship and all authoritarian regimes that constantly oppress their civilians. Why has this occurred? Because one, ethnic tensions, right? Because of the fact that when there are two people in power and there's disproportionate power, and one of them gets in power, they want to maintain the regime and they want to maintain their government legitimacy. What they do then is want to kill off the entire other side. What they do then is they want to solidify their power to maintain their power. This regime remains in power then, they kill off their opposition, and this means that they will never stop, and they will kill anyone who causes any insecurities or any kind of inconveniences for them at all, and they will not hesitate to do so at the end of the day. This then is an erosion of democracy that they have to defend on their side of the house, because they know that the UN will intervene. They know that all of these countries are unwilling and unable to intervene into these instances, and they will continue to kill to maintain power. They will continue to erode the democracy within the countries. Why do we prevent this then? Because we tell you that in status quo, due to power asymmetry, the only way to actually end the regime is to use the military might of the very, very capable countries, to use the military might of the people like EU, to use the military might of the US, and to use the military might of France. Thoroughly then, this will be thoroughly planned, this will be thoroughly executed, and like this has already historically worked, right? In instances like the Cote d'Ivoire, where it has worked and now the regime is extremely stable. But also in Khmer Rouge, where even sanctions didn't work, right? After trying to impose sanctions, and that just ended up leaching out on the poor and causing even more people on the ground to be harmed at the end of the day. We tell you then that these peacekeeping missions were so good at the end of the day. They were likely to be successful then, and they were likely to actually have a large impact at the end of the day, because they had many incentives to do so. First, they want to maintain their international reputation, right? But secondly, they have the incentive of maintaining the cost, given that all of these interventions are very, very financially, are a large financial burden, and if their mission fails, then they're likely to just have to keep doing it again and have a large burden on their financial budget. But thirdly, they have an incentive to not repeat their past mistakes. If opposition comes up and talks about the instances where military intervention has failed in the past, we tell you that's the furthermore incentive where these countries would not allow this to happen again. That's why they will not let the insurgency and the instability that they've caused in the past continue to happen. Because that only happened and that only continued to happen because of the hesitancy that these countries had in the very first place, because of the hesitancy that allowed them to stop invading into countries and to stop allowing them to help these countries. So even if the war in Libya did cause some harm at the end of the day, the hesitancy and the absence stripped away the ability of all the other states and all of the other oppressive states to gain sovereignty and to limit atrocities at the end of the day. Proud to respond.
direct result of cultural or political beliefs and identity. That means then that they're likely to use R2P for their own good because they already have an inherent political bias or stance that they take as a country. For instance, America will support Israel. Or for example, the US goes against Nazi Germany, so they're quote-unquote anti-Semitism. And this is why it's easy to flip the narrative that they are on the right side, and they also have financial incentive of being able to secure more alliance, right? The implication then is that this proves that R2P is likely to be used in a way that justifies or benefits Western countries. So this is the likely way that their counterfactual is actually going to manifest then two ways. Firstly, Western bias. When you intervene R2P, it's an investment. You lose people, money, funding. They have to pick which side to invest in. You cannot invest in both. And that means that Western countries will now deem which countries are quote-unquote right or innocent and which is the aggressor in each situation. Right now, we see how the US backed Israel because in the past we made a promise to protect Israel and you have to help them gain their land back. But secondly then, we think there are circumstances where both sides are in the wrong, or there are many people in the wrong per se, e.g. the Yugoslav war, where every country committed mass genocide, but the international community intervened and framed someone as being in the wrong anyway at the end of the day. Before that, I'll take POI.
How subjective is mass genocide, and why then West actors just flip and do horrible things?
Mass genocide is quite subjective, right? If you look at the Israel and Palestine conflict in today's status quo. Moving on then to my argument, which will have rebuttals integrated into them. Firstly then, why R2P versus conflict? Do you think that firstly, both sides agree that there would be more Western intervention under their counterfactual, because when there exists this norm for you to want to use R2P, the Western will want to use it, what the Western already wants benefits, can use these norms as an excuse to increase intervention on their side of the house. So intervention comes in two forms. Firstly, looking like military, where they have to use a lot of supplies, soldiers, but most importantly, when you use military forces, you risk backlash from your citizens because they don't understand why are you dedicating a huge amount of money, a huge amount of manpower, a huge amount of citizens to another country. But secondly, then it also looks like sanction and it affects a country's economy. For example, if the US intervenes, it affects their economy or the global trade as a whole. So inherently, then you will always lose something when you interfere. So these countries are going to factor in what they can gain from intervening. There is no benevolent country in the world. Countries are not NGOs that are just going to go around and helping them, right? But secondly, then, when the Western intervenes, the situation is only going to get worse, and the conflict will then get escalated. Why is that? So the harm of intervention. For instance, right, in Iraq in 2003, the U.S. along with the Western and NATO allies wanted to end conflict fast in Iraq. So they used what they call a quote-unquote shock and awe method, or bombing campaign. They installed a transitional government as well after they bombed and essentially left our country. And this largely failed because of many reasons. The reason that these interventions failed was because that the tactic that they used to employ the most when Western countries intervened is they will quickly put troops on the ground, like millions of American military. So what happens then, e.g. the U.S. in Iraq, is the U.S. citizens will now see a bunch of military personnel, their own citizens, in Iraq. They see people dead in those countries, what we call the quote-unquote body bag effect. Western nations then receive political pressure from their own citizens to withdraw troops quickly, or use very strong political warfare to end the conflict quickly because they don't want to get political backlash from their own citizens. So that means that this proves that Western countries do not consider the damage that they do, the collateral damage that happens to these countries that are already ongoing conflict. For instance, we see the Agent Orange operation in Vietnam because they wanted to end the war quickly, but we see in today's status quo, Vietnamese people are still deformed because of the consequences of this action. Or the second type then are things like drone strikes or air strikes, and the goal is just to strike the area where there's quote-unquote terrorist attack, right? But this is extremely harmful because it's so hard for you to separate who are the citizens or who are actually the military in those countries. So the bottom line then is, we prove to you that it's easier for the West to now justify their action to their own communities or to citizens in using R2P for their own gain. But most importantly, we've also laid out the historical harm of Western interference. And the world on their side is not one where conflict ends quicker, but the region only gets more de-escalated, right? Because now with the US, I have already put a lot of troops there, I need to pull out because I don't want to invest even more time there. What's only going to happen is you leave a region in shambles in political instability. Second why the status quo, our counterfactual, is getting better. In the past, when the Western attacked or like quote unquote helped these countries, they helped the most poor or underdeveloped countries, e.g. Middle Eastern countries. And in the past, these countries are extremely isolated from the rest of the world or from like the geopolitical situation that was happening there. But now with like globalization or technology, we think that globalization and technology was not as good in the past. But in the current status quo today, globalization, or we live in the 21st century where even the most poor and underdeveloped countries understand that they are not as isolated. They can see the geopolitical tensions that are happening in the world. They're less likely to get taken advantage of going forward in our paradigm. Why can they not have this on their side of the house? We think that the status quo on both sides are not parallel, right? This house regret. Meaning that on their side of the house, R2P is used since World War II, meaning that this norm of you intervening and then leaving and then causing conflict in that region will always exist. On their side, they do not have a counterfactual where there's things like countries realizing that they're getting taken advantage of, citizens on the ground realizing that they're losing out on a lot by having these first world extremely developed powerful countries come to your nation, quote unquote, help you. That means then that our side of the house can prove to you the benefits of actually going forward with the status quo. They have to come up and tell us why they would want R2P to continue being the norm going forward. Extremely proud of the approach.
One quick observation to get though, and the reason why we want since first is because their own speaker on their own level didn't provide you a counterfactual under their side of the house. They said the status quo is getting better. Fact check this. Is that true, panel? And more importantly, I think they have to defend status quo. Because status quo under their side of the house, they can't just run a miracle line that status quo is getting better. Look to the people who died in the Rwandan genocide, panel. That happened as a result of the absence of invoking R2P on their side of the house. They can just come up here and say status quo is getting better without mechanism. In fact, I want to talk about, I'm just going to do a quick response on the only thing that their first speaker really said, which is that the West would be a bad actor. One, I think there's many issues with this argument because first, there's probably checks and balances, right? You don't get the ones who actually mandate the right to protect our UN actors, right? But second, I want to expand this debate and this principle to other actors as well. Notice that there's an issue that there's a current new norm about the coalition of the good willing, meaning that NATO is also capable of managing that as well. Other actors beyond the US is capable of doing that. But the last thing we find here is that if we want to talk about the benefits that the West gets from this, right? I would argue that the West probably benefits from being able to establish more democracies in these areas in the first place. And we would argue about that as de facto good at the end of the day. Second thing that is on the idea of picking sides. Panel, our POI took this up easily. Because how do you pick sides in terms of genocide? It's very clear cut that if the Hutus are killing up on the Tutsis and feeding the bodies of their dead mothers to pigs and dogs, it's very clear. You ought to end the regime of the You ought to end the reign of the Hutus because of the fact that it is very clear that they're the ones committing most of the crime. Their suggestion was, but what about the conflicts which are unclear, which are maybe they're being funded by both sides, or whatever it may be. Panel, I want to flag out a few things here. In some cases, the reason why R2P isn't employed is because you simply cannot deploy it in those instances. right? For example, look to instances at which, for example, maybe a country vetoed that in the first place, or for countries which are actually invading for pseudo RTPs. What I mean by this is that countries that invade for their own gain would do it on both sides of the house. So on their side of the house, look to countries like Russia, which justify RTP as a method to invade Ukraine, right? I think that's not the kind of RTP that we have to defend at the end of the day. Because on our side of the house, the RTP is heavily regulated by the international community because we're still going to involve at the end of the day. There's more regulation on to what extent can RTP be used under our side of the house, because it is still an action that is actively being done, and it's a principle that is justifying things like intervention that other countries just can't see when it's used. That capacity to misuse happens under their side of the house panel, because there's no active use under their side of the house. When outside of the UN using right to protect, countries just assume the role themselves and just be like, hey, since I don't want to be seen as an individual who's just here for like selfish gains, I might as well say I'm protecting them and just going and invading the world. That is why US under their side of the house invaded Iraq. Why was it to actually protect people? No, it was to get the owners under their side of the house, right? But secondly, I think that means that the idea, the regulation of the narrative of the RTP is much better under our side of the house, preventing all those misuses under their side. Second thing, the next thing I want to talk about then is this idea about, I just want to but also just want to flag out what are the alternatives that they have in their hands. Given that first figure didn't defend Canada, I think that everything can see a different status quo. What that looks like is that countries stay stagnant. Even in Rwanda, sure, maybe the conflict eventually ended, but the millions of lives that could have been saved beforehand were still not saved under their shutdowns. Countries continue to use sanctions, use things like sanctions under their shutdowns, and diplomacies that don't work under their side. We would suggest that all these underdeveloped alternatives only work exclusively well when you have intervention to leverage it at the end of the day. I'm going to talk about three things. First, why is the intervention effective in its inherent nature? Second, why in the long run we're actually able to establish more, why the stability is established on our side of the house, and why reconstruction is much better. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why the counterfactuals are all horrible at the end of the day. First, let's talk about the idea of why interventions are correct. Note that in these contexts of genocide, these dictatorships have asymmetrical power and disproportionate power over these individuals. One ethnic group obviously in the end of the day, and in order to solidify that power, they use their military to oppress all these other groups. We think that the only way you can contest this effectively, is to deploy a powerful military that cannot be challenged. They may say that, oh, but what if we just radicalize it more about intervention? I think that's not true, because I think it's much harder to deny the military might of the West nowadays, right? It's much harder to say that you definitely have to beat the West at the end of the day. Notice that a lot of instances, we are probably much better in terms, it's probably much more clear that the West is far more power at the end of the day. But one more thing to note then, before that, sure.
How will invasion ever be principled? Because when they invade countries, they kill people and they impose these economic policies. This is not reparations.
What do you mean by like invade these people and kill people? Like I think under US people also die, right? So I think we need to make a judgment on which side saves more lives ultimately, with a side which actually creates ceasefire zones for their civilians, or a side that lets that dictator continue to erode the civil liberties in their day, solidify their power, and kill all those people at the end of the day, right? So at least panel, one concrete benefit under our house is, even if it's true that maybe the forces are going to be close, maybe you have to just deploy destructive power, comparatively speaking, within our house, at the very least, we create ceasefire zones where civilians can at least stay and find refuge in the end of the day. But second, we think that this gives room for why more support and more developmental aid is far more likely to be enacted at the end of the day. Note that we need cooperation with the people post-conflict, right? And this is what they want to talk about, reconstruction. I'll take them at the very best case. The reason why reconstruction is much better here is, sure, maybe anti-West sentiment exists on both sides, but what is clear then is there are inherently people who will benefit from the West intervention. There are people who will not lose their children as a result of having the West defend them. There are people, and these peacekeepers on the ground are literally active deterrents against them and acting even more violence at the end of the day. Because the fact that you see someone with a blue helmet means that you ought know that you ought not shoot them, because that means that the West must deploy all their forces in response in the end of the day, because that is a massive international crime at the end of the day. The point here then is that you're likely to at least have more support for the West under our side of the house. That leads to cooperation. That's allow things like more cooperation for things like democratic institutions to better be established under our side of the house. That was the main problem as to why things like stability was eroded in the first place, because of the lack of stable democratic institutions. They then say that the West have short-term incentives. I want to point out a few things here. Number one, I think in a world where like our side of the house, where it's still going to be an activity that you can just mandate and invoke other countries to do them in the end of the day, what that means then is inherently you will have to intervene again if another country ensues in the end of the day. That's exactly why you don't want to lose that cost in the end of the day. You want to make sure that cost you invested in does its job and make sure no more other countries happen in the end of the day. That's why I tell you it's only on our side of the house where the West actually changes. But on their side of the house, the West takes on the West and other actors like Russia take on these pseudo roles and end up invading them for their own benefits in the end of the day. But lastly, I just want to point out this idea of signaling effect and deterrence, right? I just want to note that on our side of the house, we made this an option that we can leverage against these dictatorships. Number one, we show them that violence is no longer a legitimate means of garnering power. They cannot just do things like wipe out civilians because that just means that we will actually come in and just defeat their forces and reconstruct society. Meaning the incentive change on our side of the house. The odds of dictatorship rising on our side is far less after the conflict, because now you recognize that you probably have to garner support from democratic means and earn support of the people. But second, know that diplomacies are formal at the end of our side of the house and negotiations. Why? Because when you have the leverage of the power of the military might on our side of the house, what that means then is because the regime is hesitant to go against you, they are far more, and they believe that it's going to cost them more, they are far more likely to settle down for more peaceful resolutions in the end of the day, or more ceasefires, and at least more democratic transitions in the end of the day. But lastly, I just want to do three quick things. I'd like to say three quick things here. Firstly, I think that on our side of the house, people in general will be far more grateful that if the West was just staying there and throwing money to the issue without actually giving up proper things. DLO has to come up here and prove a counterfactual, but it's too late for them to insert anything, They have to defend status quo. We're very proud to propose.
I'm recording the microphone, but you do not have to set up.
Oh, this is the microphone.
That's the microphone. It will be this side if you want. Just basically on it.
Military might of Uncle Sam looks like Operation Orange in Vietnam, where even nowadays millions of babies are still born deformed. It looks like Uncle Sam bombing Cambodia, leaving millions disfigured and disabled. It looks like drone strikes that try to counter terrorism because they think it's the most effective or the most accurate, but the technology is still failing. Because the way that these drone strikes work is they try to attack areas where they recognize that there's terrorist activities. For example, grouping of people together. But that could also mean simply civilians coming together to talk, or villagers coming together to talk to their village elders. As you can see, there are many ways interventions have historically gone wrong and can go wrong in the past. Both sides can agree that there are good and bad cases of Western intervention. But I'm going to prove to you why, number one, the incentives of these international communities, which have a strong Western bias, will be bad. But number two, even if there is a good incentive, why do they not have the capacity to enact these interventions? Well, let's address the elephant in the room first of all. Who are these international communities? They said themselves that the debate takes place right after World War II. Kendall tries to tell you that, the US or Western nations can't just go balls because, again, they have global balance or checks and balances from the UN. The United Nations was formed from the League of Nations, which were the winners of World War II. And it's the countries they said themselves that they are the US, France, UK, or even if you want to talk about the International Criminal Court. Again, International Court has historically had a bias against the Global South, like disproportionately prosecuting dictators from the Global South as opposed to war criminals from other countries. So this exactly proves our case, that in their international community, there is a heavy Western bias simply because of the fact that this debate is set after World War II, but simply because the countries in that era that can actually have enough money to care about these conflicts in the first place are the Western countries, not countries like Japan or China, which are powerful today, yes, but back then they were still struggling economically from after the war. This means a couple of things then. Firstly, when they ethnic cleansing or genocide, so we don't have to intervene. We've already done enough with our right to protect. But when they want to say that, oh, these countries learn from the past, the US will learn from Iraq. Look, this debate, please look at me. This debate is set here after World War II. The only reason we realize right now that the US was unsuccessful in its intervention was because of the Iraq and thingies happening in the 2000s. That means before they can learn their mistakes, this time frame here, when there's increased Western intervention, it's likely going to be the bad forms of Western intervention that we have already told you multiple times in this debate, for example, Iraq or Afghanistan. What happens then was the US deploying troops with NATO or with the international communities, mind you, into these countries to end the conflict as fast as possible, and then having to pull out because then the US citizens were like, wait, that's too much money. What happens is a power vacuum that Peach has told you from the beginning, right? When there's a power vacuum in these countries, it means that the people in these countries have not adjusted peacefully or gradually. What they understand is the West came in, deployed some troops, and killed the leader, and now there is a power struggle of who wants to get to the top. If they want to talk about anything about transitional governments that these international communities can help with, I would like them to name one example of a successful transitional government historically. Sure.
In Côte d'Ivoire, now is one of the most stable countries democratically in the status quo. That was a transitional government, but even if we didn't have that, why don't you want to stop atrocities?
Okay, look, the case on our side is simple. It's the fact that on your side, even though you can quote-unquote stop atrocities tokenistically, it's not actually stopping them. It's collateral harms to citizens. It's destabilization of these countries into the long term, which means even more undemocratic and abusive practices, which again may not be considered ethnic cleansing. That's why there won't be more interventions into the future. But also, Pien, you only named one example of a successful transitional government, which is Côte d'Ivoire, which they have good resources and stuff like that. So I don't think that applies to every single developing nation in the world, especially on your side, where there's increased Western intervention, there's a high risk of transitional governments going wrong. But also, we want to talk then about the capacity of these countries. What Peach crucially told you is that mass genocide has many instances. For example, in some circumstances, it is subjective, for example, the Yugoslav war, because every country was genuinely killing each other, like cleansing the ethnicities of other people. Every country in that war was responsible. What Peach pushed to you was a slightly counterfactual, was that since these international communities are composed with the most powerful Western countries who inherently have a political standing or a political incentive, because again, when they intervene, they also lose out on money and troops. There has to be a benefit that comes from it, for example, increased alliance. In these types of conflicts, we tell you that instead of the Yugoslav war, where they were killing themselves, like yes, atrocities happened, but at the very least, it ended there. On your side of the house, the US or these Western nations will use the right to protect as a way to justify choosing one country as the main aggressor, as the one committing the genocide, and the other as the victim. This is still bad because the Western nations can then impose things like for example, threatening them that they have to pay reparations to countries, or using these excuses to intervene even further, right? But secondly then, when you try to talk about developing nations and abusive regimes like the leaders ethnically cleansing these people, we also tell you that interventions make it worse. Because at the very least, on our side of the house, when this happens, it's troops fighting on the ground. And again, these are developing nations, so they are most likely not going to have mass weapons of destruction. But when the West comes in and starts employing drone strikes or these weapons, it is going to worsen the conflict. More lives are lost, more inaccuracies happen, and destabilization happens afterwards. But even if it is true that you are going to use military troops, look at Hamas right now. What are they doing? They use Gaza civilians who act as body shields against US troops. More lives are going to be lost on your side of the house because these leaders will not stand still and have US troops overtake them. They will use these civilians as body shields, and US soldiers will not be able to distinguish between them or are simply too far
why we go to the grand finals against Jetty from is because on their side of the house, the comparative to a might be unstable government or unstable government is the same authoritarian regime that is ethnically cleansing cities, for example, in Iraq, for example, in Bosnia, for example, in Rwanda. At the very least, under our side of the house, we tried to prevent this atrocity, and it was the most certain impact in this round. I want to ask 3 questions in my speech. First, who are these actors, and are they benevolent? Secondly, does collateral damage happen during invasions, and why is ending the atrocities the most important impact in this round? And lastly, I want to talk about, can we do post-war reconstruction and talk about the comparative? First question then, who are these actors? They are Western states, sure. And that's why we say that they should be Western states, because they have the military might to do so. They say that, oh, they're going to use the worst forms and they're not going to be benevolent in terms of invading these countries. I think it was pretty clear that there was intense scrutiny that Kendall talked about in his speech. For instance, Western actors, and at that time was trying to expand their influence, and then they tried to, for example, have good public image. And we think, therefore, that collateral damage under these circumstances are likely to be less, and they have good incentives to do really well. But secondly, it is not unilateral like what they say under their side. There are many actors within the UN, and they make sure that within the UN agreements, what they're doing is correct. For instance, they can't just go in and take all of their oil, but there are certain things and certain rules and regulations as to how you can intervene in these countries. And for example, you can put in blue helmets. For example, you can go in and topple governments, and you should make sure, no, thank you, that not a lot of civilians were killed, because if they are killed, there was going to be massive backlash. Why then do we say that just because they assert that there were some instances of Western killing some individuals, why was that the best alternative? Firstly, we think that the West, for example, has incredible military precision, and the best there was in status quo at that time, or wherever that time was. On their side, they'll shoot machine guns. On their side, they'll shoot whatever, they'll bomb civilian areas. Under our side of the house, we have much more precise drone strikes that, for example, can take out individuals who are soldiers. They say, lastly then, that it is simply impossible to know who is who, and it is simply impossible to pick the right winners. Firstly, on picking the right winners. I don't think that the right winner is the main concern now. I think the main concern is to stop the atrocities. So if Serbia and other countries were fighting, we need to make sure that we put troops there and fight against all those militaries to make sure that those atrocities stop. But secondly, even if Crab went to world schools with me and then talk about Yugoslav, I think that Serbia was clearly the main person who committed genocide by numbers, but more importantly, the majority of states in the status quo, you can see, have committed mass atrocities, and what Kendall framed to you since first is that there was disproportionate power that allowed them to commit mass atrocities in the first place, but even if there were 2 powers that are large, we still think that the states can check both powers at the same time. You want to pick a winner? You can, and we think that they are likely to pick the winner that are most suitable under these circumstances, and they have an incentive to do so. Therefore, the West isn't the worst actor in the world, and even if they say that the West are the worst actor in the world, we question if the West would do sanctions, if the West would do anything under their sort of house, because they can still do this selfish incentives, but under those circumstances, there was no scrutiny to make sure that those atrocities stop. Second question, does collateral damage happen, and why is ending these atrocities so important? Firstly then, Peach talks about not differentiating soldiers. I think she reads a lot in terms of matter banking, but it doesn't happen to have any impact in this round. Because, for instance, during warfare, you kill everyone anyways. Wars happen under their sort of house anyways. And we think, therefore, that Western actors can still likely to be able to differentiate these individuals. For instance, like the costumes that they wear, or for more importantly, just like trying to topple government does not necessarily mean that you have to kill all the soldiers that exist in the status quo. But secondly, they say that they have horrible incentives which will cause collateral damage, which will do it as fast as possible. Firstly, if I can prove that doing it as fast as possible and is effective, we win the round. So, first class I already told you that they have incredible military precision, like things like drone strikes, but they also had much better military might. And we think that in the worst case under ours of the hospital, thank you, we kill the soldiers and we don't kill the civilians, and we make sure that civilians are, like, for example, majority are protected. But secondly, there were massive media scrutiny for countries who violate sovereignty in the first place, and more importantly, there were, for example, scrutiny within UN actors to make sure that this sovereignty was done well. And thank you, so people trust the UN in the long run. Therefore, they are more likely to do this well because they don't want to come back again in the world where this is a norm where people need to do R2P. They will try to make sure that they will do it the best way possible. We think, therefore, that when they talk about domestic scrutiny, I want to flip this. They say that the Western actors don't have any incentive because they just want to pull their actors back immediately. I think that the West is very sympathetic and empathetic towards genocides that kills millions of children, millions of women in the status quo. For instance, people in the West are telling, for example, everyone that the genocide in Palestine needs to be stopped. It was only under our office we can translate that advocacy into real change. But even if domestic scrutiny wasn't a real thing, we still think that the UN agreement under our house be strengthened so that these individuals had an obligation to intervene. Anyways, they say then that, oh, it is very convenient for me to pick two examples and say why we win the round. Firstly, they have to prove a burden where the majority of them do not succeed, and we think that we have proved that the majority of them do succeed. But they say about Afghan and Iraq. I think that the mass atrocities stopped, and in the instance where the blue helmets were there was, for example, a low rise in insurgency, and only when they pulled out after 20 years, maybe there was a bit of a higher rise in insurgency. We think under those states, the bad things will happen anyways. We cannot construct the perfect world. But we think in a world where other states come in, it was only under those circumstances that Afghan and Iraq can stop the war that happened under those circumstances and had a peaceful world. Therefore, we think that atrocities were much better under our house. These were the innocent individuals that they say that we should neglect and just close our eyes and pray that one day things will be better. Things would never be better in the instance where there wasn't another actor to check this disproportionate power. Third question then on post-war reconstruction. We tell you under our also there was an incentive to do post-war reconstruction. Well, because for example there was intense scrutiny with Obama in the instance where his regime change was done not well. We think therefore that it was only under our house that, for example, in the worst case you have one or two bad, and then in the majority of instances it will be done well. Why? Because they talk about hard vacuum. We think that in the status quo, what is important is that you have blue helmets on the ground. We believe that it was only with blue helmets, even if you pick the wrong winners, they cannot violate, for example, do things like mass atrocities under their side. So even if we don't fully transition to a democratic government, at the very least that power vacuum, maybe there are civil wars, but then soldiers just fight each other, but there are proper mechanisms to protect these civilians under our set of house. So that post-war was just much, much better. But secondly, transitional governments do work, and if we give you two or three examples, it's pretty good. Why? Because they say that countries like Rwanda can come out of the war suddenly so magical. Rwanda is similar to Cote d'Ivoire, in which they need to prove to me more than 800 or 900,000 individuals in Rwanda who have been ethnically cleansed are people who we should not, for example, save. Therefore, then we think that transitional governments do work. What was their last-ditch response then? They talk about anti-West sentiments. We think that anti-X sentiments can come by under both sides of the house. For example, people in power will always be angry at certain people, but we think at the end of the day there was much better incentives under our house that we had military might to control those sentiments and make sure that those sentiments don't rise. Only under our house we have individuals in these countries to ensure that violence do not happen. Sometimes it can lead to great democracies, which is amazing, but even in the worst case where it does not lead to a great democracy, at the very least we make sure that civilians are protected in the long run, and civilians were protected in Afghan for 20 years, civilians were protected in Iraq, and civilians were protected in Libya, for instance, even though civil wars may or may not occur. It was only under our side that we made sure that people who had power stopped the conflict and stopped the atrocity. The ballot has never been clearer, and I know judges just love private gas with high, so please, very, very easy ballot, very proud to propose.
they kill people, like drone strikes. It's like literally impossible to protect people as well because they will try to be the most cost effective. They will try to end the war as quickly as possible, right? And then only that, they will also impose ECOP policies, as we've seen in like World War II, when after they beat Germany, they imposed so much policies that make that country like literally like really hard for them to develop and go on, right? Not only that, but the reason they do this is that it is to prevent them from causing more wars, and they have to defend this in the long term. That like if they want to stop wars in the very first place, they have to impose all these laws. For example, like So the implication is that the invasion will never be principled in the very first place. Plus the layer that you're actually perpetuating colonialism even more with the implication that for these countries to actually be developed, you have to go in and to impose all these Western policies on them. Okay, fine. Like, sure, the West may not be perfect, but you have to prove why the West is inherently benevolent. In the instance where the reason why they became absent was because they felt so regretful and so guilty about the harms that they caused to Libya. No, the reason the West has removed themselves is not because they feel bad of the atrocities they've committed. It's because other people, the global realization that these invasions have done more harm than good, and if they're going to go into these countries, it is going to be heavily scrutinized, and that is why there is no longer this prevalent narrative that they are trying to bring back, right? Not only that, but it's so crazy for Kim to come up and try to proclaim that the U.S. will be very empathetic towards global cleansing or like wars in general, because how many American propaganda movies made a blockbuster in Hollywood are there about Iraq? But instead, it's never about Iraq, it's never about the people that are killed, but it's about the American soldiers, Uncle Sam's little boys, who are going to be so sad that they're going to go to war, they get PTSD and everything. U.S. media will only show the dead bodies of U.S. soldiers, never the body of Rwanda. The implication of this is that there will be less to no sympathy for the thing in general, and if they're going to feel sympathy, they will feel sympathy for the U.S. in general. And this only causes more incentive for the U.S. to pull out when they see damage done against them. Second fact is that, will the force be excessive? So, they try to push urgency, right? That these countries are going like really badly. They have ethnic cleansing. We have to stop it immediately. So it doesn't make sense for NJ to come since first and say that no, this will not be excessive. Because for you to stop it completely and really fast, you have to use drone strikes. You have to send in Agent Orange. This is the reason why it is going to be that these people are actually being ethnically cleansed, and this is why it's so bad. But if the U.S. comes in, and goes to war directly, you are able to see less why it's so important. So third of all, it's about Reconstruction and why it will be very unlikely to happen, right? So the biggest point coming from our side is that no matter what, even if you establish a new government, even if you do everything, you can never truly stop ethnic cleansing on their side. So why is this? As my first speaker and second speaker have extensively told you, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, implies that there is a person committing a crime and there is the humanity that is being injustice against. Everything is entrenched in political narratives about who is the aggressor, who is the people being aggressed against, right? So when you come in and stop these crimes against humanity, they will only stop the crimes that they see as being crimes. They will protect people who they see as marginalized. It's very, you can't deny that Palestinian people are being currently genocided. But still, what the U.S. does is that they paint that the Israel people are being marginalized for being brought to their homeland. And this is actually what is going to happen. They live on, their case lies on the assumption that the atrocities will very end in the first place, right? So, but even if ethnic cleansing ends, they have killed people so much with their droning that is going to be the same impact. Even if they don't kill enough people, why these civilization, which is our harms, are more intensive, is because it's going to be in the long term. People will have to take so much time to recover, and therefore these ethnic cleanses will never end. Therefore, props and votes.
Very sneaky, because I think throughout this debate, everyone understands that the checks and balances system that they want to put in place are not there, because they time-framed this debate after World War II, where Western nations were still the ones dominating with the capacity. So what he did was to grasp the most obvious benefits they have on their side and to grossly underestimate the harms of our side of the house. Here's what he did at the end of this debate. He said, at the very least, number one, we stop ethnic cleansing. And number two, at least we have peacekeepers on the ground for protection. Look at the incentives of the international community. These benefits only accrue when it is good intervention. We don't think that the international community is going to focus a large amount of their funding or troops on protecting these civilians or creating these ceasefire zones that they want so bad. Because we have already told you that when there's intervention, there is a cost to it. There is an investment into stopping this conflict as fast as possible. That's why we told you it is going to be things like drone strikes, missile attacks, or mass weapons of destruction targeted towards an area. And then Piem grossly underestimates the harms of this by saying, the drone strikes are accurate. Piem, this was literally decades ago when people did not realize the harms of drone strikes. That is why it was being used. I factually told you that drone strikes or AI or any sort of system can never be accurate because it focuses on pattern recognition. But again, we've already seen the harms of pattern recognition because in war, there is no pattern. It is entirely organic. There's civilians. You cannot differentiate between soldiers and civilians or between terrorist organizations and simply civilians crowding together. What that means then that on their side of the house, these what?